the macabre history behind the Stump houses in Appalachia. Now, before we begin, I want to know where you are right now and what time it is there. Leave your answer in the comments. I find it incredible that the same story can reach so many different corners of the world at so many different times of day. Now let's get back to it, because what happened in the Appalachian Mountains in the fall of 1887 is something history has tried very hard to forget, and we're not going to let that happen. The mountains did not care about the Cutter family. That was the first thing anyone learned upon arriving in the Appalachians without money, without connections, and without a plan beyond the desperate arithmetic of survival, that the mountains predated every human ambition by millions of years, and that they would outlast every human failure by millions more. They rose and fell in long, slow ridges like the breathing of something impossibly ancient, draped in forests so thick and so dark that the light filtering down through the canopy arrived at the ground already exhausted, already gray, already stripped of whatever warmth it had carried when it left the sky. This was the Appalachian Mountains in the autumn of 1887, and somewhere on a rutted logging road that barely deserved the name, winding down through the West Virginia highlands like a scar carved into the hillside by men who came, took what they wanted and left, a family was walking. Elijah Cutter was 38 years old, though he looked closer to 50. He was not a tall man, but he was built the way working men of that era were built, thick through the chest and shoulders, with forearms roped with muscle from 11 years of feeding raw cotton into textile machinery at a mill outside of Roanoke, Virginia. His hands were his most telling feature. Large, scarred along the knuckles from 100 small industrial accidents, with permanent dark lines in the creases where no amount of washing had ever fully removed the grease and cotton dust of a decade of labor. He walked at the front of the group, as he always had, not because he was certain of where he was going, but because someone had to walk at the front, and Elijah Cutter had never in his adult life allowed himself the luxury of walking at the back. Behind him, matching his pace with the quiet, determined stride of a woman who had stopped being surprised by hardship sometime around her 25th birthday, walked his wife, Mary. Mary Cutter, née Halstead, was 34 years old. She was lean in the way that women who had worked hard since childhood were lean. Not delicate, not fragile, but economical, as though her body had long ago made a decision to carry only what was absolutely necessary and shed everything else. Her dark hair was pinned up beneath a cloth bonnet that had been new 3 years earlier and was now the color of the road they were walking on. She carried a canvas bag over one shoulder and Ruth over the other, their 7-year-old daughter, who had fallen asleep 40 minutes ago and was being transported through the Appalachian wilderness in a state of complete unconsciousness, one small arm dangling, entirely unbothered by the world. Thomas walked behind them. Thomas was 16, and 16 in 1887 in the Appalachian foothills was not the same as 16 in any era that followed. He was not a child, had not been a child for years. Not since he began working half-days at the mill alongside his father at the age of 13. Not since he had understood, with the particular clarity that comes from watching adults fail in slow motion, that the world his parents had built was constructed on foundations that could be pulled away at any moment by people they would never meet and who would never know their names. He walked with his hands deep in his coat pockets and his jaw set hard and his eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance. Not on the road ahead, not on his parents, but somewhere inside himself, where he was already rehearsing the argument he had not yet had the courage to speak aloud. The family had been walking for 2 days. They had left Roanoke on a Tuesday morning, 23 days after the Halcyon Textile Company posted a notice on the mill door informing its 412 employees that operations would cease permanently at the end of the month. No explanation accompanied the notice. No severance was offered. No acknowledgement was made of the fact that some of those 412 people had given a decade or more of their lives to a building that would now be stripped and sold by men who had never once set foot on its floor. Elijah had stood in front of that notice for a long time, long enough that other men came, read it, and walked away in silence. Long enough that the morning shift began arriving and found him still standing there, reading the same 14 words over and over as though they might rearrange themselves into something less final. They did not. He spent the following 3 weeks attempting methodically and without panic to find another way. He went to the other mills in the county. He went to the farms on the outskirts of Roanoke that always needed day labor during harvest season. He went to the railroad office, the lumber yard, the livery stable, and the freight depot on the south side of town. He was not too proud for any of it. Pride was a thing Elijah Cutter had carefully set aside years ago. Not discarded, never discarded, but set aside, the way a man sets aside a tool he cannot currently afford to use. But 1887 was not a generous year. The country was still crawling out from beneath the long depression that had followed the Panic of 1873, and in the industrial towns of the Appalachian foothills, the crawling was slower and more painful than anywhere else. Every man Elijah approached told him the same thing in different words: "There is nothing here for you." On the 19th day, a man named Clarence Webb, a former mill worker who had left Roanoke 2 years earlier and returned only to visit a sick cousin, sat down beside Elijah on the steps of the freight depot and told him about the valleys. "Logging companies came through 10-15 years ago," Clarence said, turning his hat in his hands the way men do when they are about to say something they are not entirely certain about. "Cut everything worth cutting and moved on, left the stumps behind. Some of those stumps, Elijah, I am not exaggerating when I tell you this. Some of them are large enough to stand up inside, large enough for a whole family." Elijah had studied Clarence's face for a long moment. "People are living in tree stumps," he said. "People are surviving in tree stumps," Clarence replied. "There's a difference." Elijah had turned that distinction over in his mind for 4 days before he told Mary. He had sat with it at night after the children were asleep, running through it from every angle he was capable of. And Elijah Cutter was a man capable of many angles. He knew what it would mean. He knew what it would look like from the outside to bring his family to a hollow in the mountains and tell them that a dead tree was their home now. He knew the word that people with addresses and front doors and the unexamined confidence of those who had never been forced to question their right to exist in a house would use to describe the Cutter family, if they ever thought about them at all. He told Mary on a Thursday evening after Ruth had fallen asleep and Thomas had gone outside to sit on the stoop in the cold, the way he often did when he was thinking about things he was not ready to discuss. He told her plainly without softening it, because Mary had never once in 11 years of marriage asked him to soften anything. He told her about the stumps, about the size of them, about Clarence's description of families living inside them, about the fact that he had exhausted every other option he could identify. Mary listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of shock, not the silence of disbelief, but the silence of a woman processing information and deciding what to do with it. "How far?" she asked. 2 days' walk, maybe 3 with the children." "Do we know anyone there?" "No." Another silence. "Then we'll have to introduce ourselves," she said, and stood up to begin sorting what they would take and what they would leave behind. The road descended sharply around a bend, and the trees on either side grew taller and pressed closer together overhead, their branches interlocking in a canopy so dense that the gray afternoon light turned green and strange before it reached the ground. Ruth stirred against Mary's shoulder, opened her eyes briefly, regarded the dark forest on either side of the road with the mild curiosity of a child who had not yet been taught to find unfamiliar places threatening, and fell back asleep. "How much farther?" Thomas asked. His voice was flat and carefully emptied of the frustration underneath it. "Clarence said the valley was half a day past the second creek crossing," Elijah said, without turning around. "We crossed the second creek an hour ago." He could have been wrong. He could have been. Silence returned, the sound of their feet on the packed dirt road. Somewhere high above them, invisible in the canopy, a bird called once and did not call again. "Pa, Thomas, I need you to tell me this is going to be different from what I think it is." Elijah walked for several steps before answering. He had never been a man who offered his children comfortable lies. He considered the truth a form of respect, a way of saying, without saying it, "I believe you are strong enough to hear it." "I can't tell you that," he said. I don't know what it's going to be yet. Neither do you." Thomas exhaled slowly through his nose and said nothing more. But the muscle along his jaw tightened in a way so exactly like his father's expression that Mary, watching from behind, felt something complicated move through her chest. Grief and love and a fierce, aching pride, all wound together so tightly she could not have separated one from the others if she had tried. They smelled the valley before they saw it. Wood smoke, the particular sharp, sweet smell of chestnut burning, different from oak, different from pine, carrying a deeper and older quality, as though the wood itself held more years than ordinary timber. And underneath it, barely detectable but unmistakably present, the smell of people, of cooking and animals and human habitation gathered together in a small enclosed space. Then the road curved for the last time, the trees pulled back on either side, and the valley opened before them. It was not large, perhaps a quarter-mile wide and half a mile long, cupped between two ridges that rose steeply on either side, their upper slopes still thick with the forest that the logging companies had apparently not considered worth the effort of harvesting. The valley floor was lower, more open, and scattered across it as far as Elijah could see in the fading afternoon light were the stumps. They were extraordinary. He had imagined stumps the way most people imagine stumps. Low, flat, unremarkable discs of wood left behind when a tree is cut down. What stood in this valley was something of an entirely different order. These were the remnants of American chestnuts that had been ancient when the first European settlers arrived in these mountains. Trees that had grown for 300 and 400 years before a logging company saw ever touched them, and that had been cut at a height of 3 or 4 feet from the ground, leaving behind columns of wood that rose chest high or higher, many of them 8, 10, 12 feet across. And inside those columns, hollowed by rot and by human hands, carved and shaped and made habitable by generations of desperate ingenuity, people were living. Elijah could see it now, as his eyes adjusted to the valley's strange light. The rough-cut openings that served as doorways, some of them framed with salvaged lumber. The crude windows, some covered with oiled cloth, some open to the cold air. The thin threads of smoke rising from holes cut into the tops of several stumps. Makeshift chimneys serving makeshift hearths inside makeshift homes. A line of laundry strung between 2 stumps, gray shirts and work trousers shifting slowly in the valley breeze. A dog barked somewhere, a child laughed, and a bright, uncomplicated sound that carried across the valley floor and dissolved into the darkening air. The ordinary sounds of human beings engaged in the ordinary business of staying alive. Mary stood beside her husband, her sleeping daughter still against her shoulder, and looked at the valley for a long time without speaking. She took in the stumps, the smoke, the laundry line, the narrow paths worn between the hollow trunks by the repeated passing of feet. She took in all of it, quietly, thoroughly, the way she took in most things, completely, without flinching. "It's real," she said at last. "Yes," Elijah said. "People are actually living here." "Yes." A pause. "Good," Mary said quietly. "Then so can we." Thomas said nothing. He stood slightly apart from his parents and looked at the valley with an expression he had been constructing and refining for the past several months. The expression of someone who has already decided, in advance, not to be affected by whatever they are about to encounter. Detachment, distance. The careful performance of a young man who believes that feeling too much is the same as losing. But he was 16 years old, and he had walked 2 days through the mountains, and he was more tired than he had ever been in his life. And the wood smoke rising from the valley smelled of warmth, and the sound of that child laughing in the distance sounded like something he could not name but recognized immediately, in some place that existed below the performance. Almost without being aware that he was doing it, Thomas reached out and placed his hand flat against the nearest stump, a massive column of dark, weathered wood standing at the valley's edge, cut long ago, its surface silver gray and textured with decades of rain and frost. The wood was cold beneath his palm, dense, solid in a way that the mill walls in Roanoke, for all their brick and mortar, had never quite managed to feel. He pulled his hand back quickly as though the contact had embarrassed him. Elijah, who had seen, said nothing. The stump the Cutter family would call home stood near the eastern edge of the valley, closer to the ridge than most of the others, a position that Hattie Boggs, whom they had not yet met, would later tell them, was a genuine advantage. "Ridgeside catches the morning sun," she would say. "In a valley like this, morning sun is not a small thing." The stump itself was roughly 10 feet in diameter at the cut, the remnant of a chestnut that had already been several centuries old when the logging crews arrived in the 1870s. Its walls were nearly 3 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly toward the top, and they were remarkable in their density. American chestnut wood contains natural tannins that resist rot and fungal decay even after the tree is dead. And this stump had stood for over a decade with its structural integrity almost entirely intact. Patient, enduring, waiting without urgency for whatever came next. Someone had been there before them. That was the first thing Elijah noticed as he stepped through the rough-cut doorway, which was framed, he saw now, with pieces of split lumber nailed carefully to the inner edges of the wood, giving the opening a doorway's proper shape and stability. The floor inside was packed dirt, hard as fired clay, worn smooth by the passing of previous feet. Against one curved wall, someone had carved a series of shallow shelves directly into the wood, 3 of them rising to shoulder height, sized to hold tins and tools and small necessities. Near the center of the floor, a ring of stones marked where a fire had burned many times before. The ceiling and the inner surface of the stump's hollow top was darkened black with years of accumulated smoke, but sound, intact. There was no furniture. No possessions had been left behind. Whoever had lived here last had taken everything they could carry and left the rest, the shelves, the fire ring, the framed doorway, as a gift to whoever came after. Elijah turned slowly in the center of the space, taking inventory. 10 feet across, walls 3 feet thick, a working fire ring already laid, shelves already carved, a doorframe already built. He was not a sentimental man. He had spent 3 weeks exhausting every alternative before arriving in this valley, and he understood, without self-deception, what it meant to bring his family here. He knew the word. He had heard it applied to other men in other hard circumstances, and he knew that some of the people who used it considered it a simple description of fact, while others used it as a verdict. He put his hand flat against the inner wall of the stump. The wood was cool, but dry, not damp, not crumbling. The walls were holding. "It'll do," he said. Mary stepped in behind him. She set Ruth down. The child woke briefly, looked around at the dark curved walls with wide and entirely untroubled eyes, sat down on the dirt floor as though she had been doing exactly this all her life, and began examining a small beetle making its way across the packed earth beside the fire ring. Mary moved to the carved shelves and ran her fingers slowly along the wood. "Someone made these carefully," she said. "Someone needed them to hold," Elijah replied. She nodded, studying them. "We'll need a door. Something real. Something that closes properly against the cold. First thing tomorrow. And something for the floor. Straw would do for now. I'll find something." She turned to look at him. In 11 years of marriage, in poverty and in slightly less poverty, in grief and in the ordinary dailiness of a hard life lived alongside someone you had chosen and continued to choose, Mary Cutter had developed the ability to read her husband with a precision that she suspected he found both deeply comforting and, on occasion, quietly unnerving. She looked at him now and she read, in the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his eyes and the particular way he was standing, exhaustion, determination, shame, love, fear, and underneath all of it, buried deepest but still present, still alive and refusing to be extinguished, hope. She decided not to name any of it. Some things were better left as what they were, felt, understood between two people, and not diminished by being spoken. "All right," she said simply, and turned to begin the work of making the space into something that could be lived in. That first night, the family slept on the ground, their coats spread beneath them as bedding, their single blanket shared between all four of them. Ruth tucked between her parents for warmth. The fire Elijah built in the stone ring filled the stump with smoke at first. The draft was wrong, the chimney hole too small. But he adjusted the stones, banked the fire lower, fed it more carefully, and by the time full darkness had settled over the valley, the temperature inside the stump had risen to something that was not warm, but was, at minimum, survivable. The rain began an hour after midnight. It was the heavy, relentless kind of Appalachian autumn rain that came down not in separate drops, but in continuous gray sheets, as though the sky had simply decided to become water for a while. Elijah lay on his back in the dark and listened to it strike the top of the stump, and heard, to his genuine surprise, almost none of it inside. The 3-foot walls, the solid ancient roof above them. The physics of a structure that had stood through decades of weather by surrendering everything soft and retaining only what could not be worn away. He thought about the mill, about the brick walls and the noise that never stopped and the machinery that did not register the difference between a man's hand and any other object that came within its reach. 11 years inside that building, and he had never once felt as certain of the walls around him as he felt right now, lying on the packed dirt floor of a dead tree in an unnamed valley in the West Virginia mountains. Thomas, lying across the fire, was not asleep. Elijah could tell by his breathing, the slight deliberate quality of it, the breathing of someone who was awake and thinking and choosing not to announce it. But neither of them spoke, and the rain came down on the valley outside, on the stumps and the ridges and the ancient chestnuts still standing on the upper slopes. And the fire burned itself down to coals, and somewhere in the dark of the valley, a dog barked once at something Elijah could not see, and then fell silent. Ruth shifted in her sleep and placed one small hand on her father's arm. Elijah covered it with his own and stared at the smoke-darkened ceiling above him, older than any living person, older than the country that had spent the past century cutting it down. And he thought about what Clarence had told him on the steps of the freight depot 19 days ago. People are surviving in tree stumps. There's a difference. He had thought he understood that sentence when he heard it. Lying here now in the hollow body of this ancient tree, with the rain outside and his family breathing quietly around him and tomorrow still entirely unwritten, he understood it differently, more completely. Survival was not the opposite of living. It was not a lesser version of it, not a failure of it. Sometimes, in the specific, unforgiving circumstances that life arranged without asking anyone's permission, survival was the foundation that everything else had to be built on. One careful day at a time. That was not a small thing. And in the valley outside, scattered across the dark floor of that nameless hollow in their own hollow trees, 23 other adults and 11 other children lay listening to the same rain, each of them carrying some version of the same thought, that they were still here, still breathing, that the walls around them were holding against the storm. And before sunrise the following morning, a knock would come at the rough-cut doorway of the Cutter family's stump, firm, unhurried, expecting to be answered, and a woman named Hattie Boggs would begin teaching them that survival, in this valley, had never been something anyone managed alone. Hattie Boggs knocked before sunrise. 3 knocks, firm, unhurried, spaced evenly apart. The knock of a woman who had decided long ago that the world moved too slowly when left to its own devices and had appointed herself, without asking anyone's permission, to speed it along. She did not knock a 4th time. She simply waited, with the patience of someone who had learned that patience and weakness were not the same thing, and listened to the sounds of a family waking up inside a stump they had only just arrived in. Elijah was already half awake when the knock came. He had been lying in the gray, pre-dawn dark, listening to the rain taper off and the valley below settle into the particular silence that follows a hard night. A silence that was not empty but full, layered with the sounds of water dripping from chestnut leaves and the distant movement of the creek at the valley's northern edge. He rose carefully, so as not to disturb Mary and the children, pulled his coat over his shoulders, and crossed to the doorway. The woman standing outside was not what he had expected. He was not entirely certain what he had expected. Something diminished, perhaps, the way hardship diminished some people, wearing them down to a kind of gray, apologetic thinness. What stood before him in the cold morning air was the opposite of diminished. Hattie Boggs was 60 years old, short and broadly built, with white hair pulled back severely from a face that had been shaped by weather and grief and time, into something that was not quite hard and not quite soft, but entirely its own thing. The face of a woman who had survived enough to have earned the right to look at the world exactly as she pleased. She was carrying a tin pot. Steam rose from it in the cold air. "You just arrived," she said. It was not a question. "Last evening," Elijah confirmed. She looked past him into the stump, a quick, assessing glance that took in the sleeping family, the banked coals, the canvas bag against the wall, and then looked back at him. "You have tools?" "An axe and a handsaw." She nodded once as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. "Your door is wrong. The way you've got that opening, the north wind comes straight through when the temperature drops. You'll need to reframe it before the first hard frost, or you'll lose the youngest one to fever before January." Elijah absorbed this without expression. "I was planning to work on it today." "Good." She held out the tin pot. "Corn porridge. There's enough for 4. Bring the pot back when you're done. It's the only one I have that size." She turned and walked back down the narrow path toward the center of the valley, her boots quiet on the wet ground, not looking back. Elijah stood in the doorway holding the pot for a moment, watching her go. Then he stepped back inside. "Who was that?" Mary asked from the floor, sitting up with Ruth still leaning against her. "I believe," Elijah said, setting the pot on the stones of the fire ring. "That was the person in charge." Over the following 3 days, the valley revealed itself to the Cutter family the way all close-knit communities reveal themselves to newcomers, slowly, partially, and with a specific wariness of people who have learned, through hard experience, that not everyone who arrives is someone you want to keep. The settlement had no official name, no elected leader, and no charter of any kind. What it had instead was Hattie Boggs, which amounted to roughly the same thing. She had arrived in the valley in the winter of 1881, 6 months after a collapsed shaft in the Boone County coal mines killed her husband Daniel and 3 other men whose names the company never entered into any formal record. She had arrived with her daughter's family, her son-in-law, her daughter, and 2-year-old Clara, and with the kind of purposefulness that grief sometimes produces in certain kinds of people. Not the purposefulness of someone who has found a reason to go on, but of someone who has decided with cold deliberateness simply not to stop. She had cut the first stump herself, or rather, she had directed the cutting, her son-in-law William doing the physical labor, while Hattie stood back with her arms crossed and told him where he was going wrong, which, in her assessment, was frequently. The result was a space that was rough but functional, and over the following months she refined it, added to it, improved it with the steady, incremental patience of a woman who understood that the only way to build something durable was to work on it every day without waiting for conditions to become ideal. Because conditions in a West Virginia hollow in the 1880s were never going to be ideal. Other families had followed, not because Hattie recruited them, she had never gone looking for anyone, but because word travels in the way that news of viable shelter always travels among people who need it, through the same informal networks of former co-workers and distant relations and strangers met at freight depots and church steps and the edges of failing farms. By the autumn of 1887, when the Cutters arrived, there were 9 families in the valley, representing somewhere between 40 and 45 people, depending on which children had been born recently enough that Hattie had not yet formally counted them. The families were as varied as the stumps they inhabited, and yet they shared, beneath all their differences, the same fundamental story. They had been useful to some industrial enterprise until they were not, and then they had been discarded, and then they had walked until they found a place that would hold them. The Drummond family, father, mother, and 4 sons between the ages of 8 and 19, had come from a failed tenant farm in eastern Kentucky, driven out when the landowner's son returned from a year in Cincinnati with new ideas about modern agricultural efficiency that turned out to mean fewer farmers and more machines. They were quiet people, inclined to work rather than conversation, and they had converted their stump into what was by common consensus the most structurally sound dwelling in the valley. The father, Earl Drummond, being a man with a particular gift for understanding how wood wanted to be cut, which angles held and which ones split under pressure. The Prentice family occupied the largest stump in the valley's center, the one with the woven rug and the east-facing window that Clara had shown Ruth on the first morning. Margaret Prentice, 41, was a former schoolteacher who had come to the valley after her husband abandoned the family in Charleston, with no money and no explanation, and never returned. She had brought her 3 children and 200 books packed in a wooden crate, the latter of which she considered the more essential cargo. She ran what passed for the valley school in the afternoons, an informal gathering of children on a flat-topped stump that served as a table, weather permitting. And she was the only person in the settlement besides Silas Drum who could read legal documents, a skill that would become considerably more important in the months ahead. Silas Drum himself occupied a small stump near the valley's southern edge, alone. He was 43, a former land surveyor from Morgantown, and the circumstances that had brought him to the valley were the subject of considerable and unresolved speculation among the other residents. He himself said only that he had made enemies in the wrong profession, which could have meant many things and probably meant all of them. He spent most of his time writing in a series of notebooks that he kept wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, and whenever anyone asked him what he was working on, he said only, "Something useful." He would, in time, be proven correct. Thomas observed all of this from a careful distance. He had developed, in the first days after their arrival, a habit of positioning himself at the valley's edges, on the ridge above, or at the far end of the logging road, or on the flat rock that jutted out from the creek bank, where he could see the settlement without being part of it. From these positions, he watched the families move through their daily routines, the morning fires, the small collective decisions about water and food and the maintenance of the paths between stumps, the way the children organized themselves into hierarchies with the swift and ruthless efficiency that children everywhere employ. He watched all of this with the expression he had arrived with, the careful, constructed detachment of someone who has decided in advance not to be moved, and told himself with regularity that he was not staying. But he was also 16, and the valley was full of people, and isolation, it turned out, was harder to maintain in a small community than it was in theory. Clara Boggs was the first to dismantle it. She was 8 years old, Hattie's granddaughter, and she had apparently inherited her grandmother's complete indifference to social barriers, because on Thomas's 4th morning in the valley, she climbed up onto the flat rock where he was sitting and announced, without preamble, that she was going to teach him to set a snare. "I don't need to know how to set a snare," Thomas said. "Yes, you do," Clara replied, with the absolute certainty of someone who has never seriously entertained the possibility of being wrong. "Everyone here does. Come on." He went, because the alternative was sitting alone on a rock, and even Thomas's pride had its limits. Clara turned out to be an exceptionally competent instructor. She had learned snare setting from her grandmother at the age of 5, and had been refining her technique ever since. And she explained each step with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who considers practical knowledge to be the only kind worth having. By the end of the morning, Thomas had set 2 snares of his own, badly in Clara's estimation, but not so badly as to be completely without hope. "My grandmother says you're angry," Clara said as they walked back toward the valley. Thomas stiffened. "Your grandmother doesn't know me." "She knows everybody," Clara said, in a tone that suggested this was simply a fact of the natural world, like the direction water flows. "She says angry is fine. She says angry means you still care. It's the quiet ones that worry her." Thomas had no answer to that. He filed it away in the part of his mind where he kept things he was not ready to examine yet, and changed the subject. Ruth, meanwhile, had adapted to the valley with the seamless ease of very young children, for whom the world is still sufficiently new that one version of it is not dramatically more surprising than another. She followed Clara everywhere, observed everything, and asked questions with the relentless frequency of a 7-year-old who has recently discovered that adults, when properly interrogated, contain multitudes. She asked Margaret Prentice about the books and was given one, a worn copy of a natural history primer, which she carried everywhere, and which she could not yet fully read but examined with intense seriousness, turning the pages slowly, and studying the illustrations of plants and animals and geological formations with the focused attention of someone taking inventory. She asked Hattie Boggs, on the morning of the 6th day, why the trees had been cut so high. Hattie looked at her for a moment. "Come here," she said. She walked Ruth to the edge of the largest stump in the valley, the chestnut that had become the settlement's informal gathering place, its flat-cut surface worn smooth by years of use as a table and meeting point. She put both hands on the wood and looked at it in the way that people look at things they have known for a long time. "The men who cut these trees," Hattie said, "wanted the straight wood, the trunk, the main body, the part they could mill into lumber and sell. They cut where the trunk was still perfectly straight before it started to taper. That was 3-4 feet up. What they left behind, they didn't consider worth anything." Ruth looked at the stump, at the carved window of her own family's dwelling, visible from where they stood, at the smoke rising from several chimney holes across the valley. "They were wrong," she said. Hattie looked down at the child. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but a near relation of one. "Yes," she said. "They were." On the 8th day, Elijah had his first real conversation with Silas Drum. It happened by accident. Elijah had walked to the southern end of the valley to assess a stand of timber on the ridge that he thought might provide good material for improving their door, and found Silas already there, sitting on a fallen log with a notebook open on his knee and a measuring tape in his hand, engaged in what appeared to be a very careful study of the valley's southern boundary. They regarded each other for a moment with the mutual, assessing silence of two private men who have both been caught doing something they consider personal. "You're the new one," Silas said. "Cutter," Elijah said. "Elijah." Silas Drum. He did not offer his hand, but he moved along the log in a way that made room. After a moment, Elijah sat down. They looked out at the valley together. From this angle, the settlement had a different quality. The stumps arranged across the valley floor looked, in the flat midday light, less like dwellings and more like the remnants they actually were, the evidence of something enormous that had once stood here and been taken away. "How long have you been here?" Elijah asked. 2 years and 4 months. Silas paused. "Give or take. What are you measuring?" Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked down at the notebook in his lap, then out at the valley, then at Elijah, the considered assessment of a man deciding how much to say to someone he has known for less than 10 minutes. "This land," he said finally, "is in dispute. Has been for 15 years, at minimum. 3 separate parties have some form of claim to it, none of them airtight, none of them resolved, which means that at some point someone is going to attempt to resolve it. And when that happens, the people living in this valley are going to need something more than the fact that they've been here." Elijah absorbed this slowly. "You're building a legal case." "I'm building documentation," Silas said. "Continuous, open, and productive use of the land. Adverse possession. It's a doctrine of common law. It exists precisely for situations where legal title has lapsed or become unclear, and living people have taken the land and made something of it. How long does it take? Depends on the court. Depends on who's on the other side." He paused. "Could be years." Elijah looked out at the valley, at the smoke from the morning fires, at Ruth, visible as a small moving figure near the creek bank, crouched over something in the water, at Mary, visible at their Stump's doorway, hanging something on the line. "Then we'd better not waste the time we have," he said. Silas studied him for a moment. Then he turned a page in his notebook and uncapped his pen. "Tell me the exact date you arrived," he said, "and describe, as precisely as you can, the condition of the stump when you found it." That evening, Elijah told Mary what Silas had shared with him. They sat by the fire after the children were asleep. Ruth on her side with one hand tucked under her cheek, Thomas with his back to them, breathing with the slightly too regular rhythm of someone pretending to be asleep while actually listening. Neither Elijah nor Mary acknowledged this. It was a habit Thomas had developed years ago, and they had long since learned to factor it into their conversations accordingly. "How solid is the claim?" Mary asked, keeping her voice low. Silas thinks it can hold if we can demonstrate enough years of continuous use. Some of the families have been here since '81. Hattie. 6 years. That's the strongest basis. Mary was quiet, watching the fire. And if someone comes before we have enough years? Elijah didn't answer immediately. He fed a piece of split wood into the fire and watched the flame take it. Then we fight it in court, he said, the way Silas says. With what money? I don't know yet. Another silence. Outside, the valley was dark and still. The creek audible in the distance, an owl somewhere on the ridge above, the faint creak of cooling wood. Elijah, Mary said. Mary. We made the right decision coming here. He looked at her. In the firelight, her face was the face he had known for 11 years. Tired, clear-eyed, entirely without illusion. How do you know that? He asked, not challenging her, genuinely asking. Because Hattie knocked on our door the first morning, she said. People who knock on doors of strangers in the cold before sunrise. They're not people who've given up. They're people who are still building something. She paused. And that's what we're going to do. Across the fire, Thomas's breathing did not change. But after a moment, very quietly, he shifted position, rolling from his back onto his side, pulling the blanket up around his shoulders, settling deeper into sleep or the performance of it. Mary watched him and said nothing. But the paper in Thomas's coat pocket, the recruiter's paper from the steel mill in Pittsburgh, crinkled softly as he moved, and in the silence of the stump, both his parents heard it, and understood that the argument that had not yet been spoken was only a matter of time. The first hard frost came in the third week of October. It arrived overnight, without the warning of a proper cold front. One evening, the valley was merely cold, the familiar damp chill of a West Virginia autumn settling into the hollows and staying there. And by the following morning, the ground was iron hard and the creek had a gray skin of ice along its shallower edges, and the breath of every person and animal in the settlement hung in the air like small, brief clouds before dissolving. Elijah had finished the door 2 days earlier. He had built it from salvaged lumber, boards pulled from the ruins of an old equipment shed at the logging road's eastern end, where the company had left behind the structural debris it didn't consider worth hauling out. The door was not elegant. It was heavy, slightly uneven, and required a firm shoulder to open properly. But it sealed against the frame with a tightness that, on that first frost morning, was the difference between a cold that was merely uncomfortable and one that could do real damage, and that fact elevated it, in Elijah's estimation, to something close to beautiful. He stood outside in the gray dawn, watching the frost catch the first weak light coming over the eastern ridge, and allowed himself a moment of something that was not quite satisfaction. Satisfaction was too finished a feeling, too closed, but was its near neighbor. A sense of a thing done correctly, in the right order, for the right reasons. Thomas came out of the stump behind him, pulling his coat closed against the cold. He stopped beside his father and looked at the frost on the valley floor. The way it had turned the packed dirt paths between the stumps a pale, delicate silver. The way the stubble of the autumn grass stood rigid and white. The way the stumps themselves had taken on a different quality in the cold light, darker and denser, more present. It's colder than I expected, Thomas said. His voice carried none of its usual guardedness, just the plain observation of someone speaking before they remember to be careful. It'll get colder, Elijah said. How much colder? Ask Hattie. She's been through 6 winters here. Thomas was quiet for a moment. I don't want to ask Hattie everything. Why not? A pause. Because asking makes it feel like staying. Elijah looked at his son. Thomas was staring at the frost on the ground, his jaw set in the way it always was when he was saying something true that he would have preferred not to say. He was, Elijah thought, and not for the first time, so much like his mother in the specific way he handled honesty. As a tool he reached for reluctantly but was constitutionally incapable of putting down when it mattered. The paper, Elijah said. Thomas looked up. The one in your coat, The recruiter's paper. For a moment, Thomas said nothing. Then, "How long have you known?" "Since before you did, probably." Elijah paused. "A man came through the mill 2 years ago. Same kind. Company man. Paid per head. Smile that worked harder than the rest of him. I watched him talk to 3 of the younger men on the floor. All 3 of them left inside of a month. And I don't know where 2 of them ended up. The 3rd one wrote to his mother from Pittsburgh 8 months later. Said the wages were real, but the housing was a barracks and the hours were longer than what he'd been promised. And the foreman had a short memory when it came to what had been agreed." Thomas absorbed this. "It could be different." "It could," Elijah said. "I'm not telling you it isn't." He paused. "I'm telling you to know what you're walking toward before you walk toward it." The frost glittered on the valley floor between them. Somewhere in the settlement, a door opened and closed, one of the other families beginning their morning. The smell of wood smoke began to drift across from Hattie's direction. "I'm not asking you to stay forever," Elijah said, and the evenness in his voice cost him something that he did not let show. "I'm asking you to stay until you know where you're going." Thomas looked at his father for a long moment. Then he looked away, back at the frost, at the stumps, at the ridge above the valley where the chestnut trees still standing caught the early light on their bare upper branches. He did not say yes, but he didn't say no either. And Elijah, who had been reading his son for 16 years, knew the difference. It was Margaret Prentice who first said the word out loud. She said it on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, at the informal gathering of the valley's adults that had been developing, over the weeks since the Cutters' arrival, into something approaching a regular community meeting, convened at the flat-topped central stump, attended by whoever was not otherwise occupied, conducted without formal rules or agenda, but with the kind of concentrated practicality that people apply to problems when they cannot afford the luxury of procedure. The meeting that Tuesday had begun with the usual matters: the state of the food stores going into winter, the question of the deteriorating path to the creek, the ongoing project of insulating the less structurally sound stumps against the coming cold. And then Margaret had set down the paper she was holding, a sheaf of documents she had walked 4 hours to the county courthouse to obtain and 4 hours back to bring home, and said the word: eviction. The gathering went quiet. She laid the papers on the flat stump top and smoothed them with her hands. "A land speculation company out of Charleston," she said, her school teacher's voice steady and clear, "purchased the tax deed on this valley 6 weeks ago, from the family in Richmond that held the original title. They paid $40. The family in Richmond, from what I can determine, was not aware that they still technically owned this land and was happy to accept $40 for a liability they didn't know they had." "Who is the company?" Silas asked from the back of the group. His face was very still. "Meridian Land and Development. They've filed 3 prior removal actions in Kanawha County in the past 4 years. They won all 3. Silas was already opening his notebook. "How long do we have?" Hattie asked. She was standing slightly apart from the group, as she often did, her arms folded across her chest, her expression unreadable. "Under state law, 30 days from formal notice. Notice hasn't been served yet. I found this at the courthouse from the filing records." Margaret paused. "Which means we have more than 30 days, but we don't know how many more." "What are our options?" Elijah asked. Silas answered before Margaret could. "Adverse possession. It's the only viable doctrine we have. But to file, we need the filing fee, $8 per claim. And we need to be strategic about which claim we file." "Why not file for each family?" Earl Drummond asked. "Because we don't have $8 per family, and because filing multiple small claims invites the court to invalidate them on procedural grounds. One strong claim, filed under the person with the longest continuous residence, is harder to dismiss than 9 weak ones." Everyone's eyes moved with the slow inevitability of a compass needle toward Hattie Boggs. Hattie did not look away from the documents on the stump. 6 years, she said. "Come January, it'll be 6 years and 2 months. "That's the strongest basis we have," Silas said. "With the documentation I've been building, boundary surveys, residency records, evidence of continuous improvement of the property, I believe it can hold. But it depends on the judge, and it depends on how well-connected Meridian land is in Morgantown. And if we lose? Mary Cutter asked. The question sat in the cold air for a moment. We find somewhere else, Hattie said. Her voice was even, not resigned, even. The voice of someone who has considered the worst outcome and decided it will not stop her from doing what needs to be done in the meantime. We're not going to lose, Silas said. And there was something in the way he said it. Not the false brightness of optimism, but the flat, technical certainty of someone who has spent 2 years building a case specifically for this moment that settled the group in a way that nothing softer could have. The money problem was real. $8 was not an abstract sum in the settlement. It represented, for most of the families, weeks of accumulated small earnings, the product of odd jobs done for wages in the nearest towns, of goods traded, of the sparse cash economy that a community largely surviving on barter and self-sufficiency could generate when pressed. It was possible. It was not easy. The discussion of how to raise it lasted 3 evenings and involved more disagreement than anything the community had previously faced. Some families had more capacity than others, and the question of how to distribute the burden equitably in a community that had no formal financial structure and no mechanism for enforcing any agreement required the kind of careful, patient negotiation that pushed the limits of what goodwill alone could accomplish. It was Hattie who cut through it on the 3rd evening. "We're talking about this wrong," she said, from the doorway of her stump, where she had been listening to the argument with increasing impatience. "This isn't a debt. It's not a loan. It's not a tax." She looked around the group. "If this claim succeeds, every family in this valley benefits. That means every family contributes what they can. Not what's fair. What they can. And we don't keep score." Another silence. A different kind than the ones before it. "I have a silver brooch," Margaret Prentice said quietly. "My mother's. I've been keeping it." She paused. "It can be melted down." A long moment. Then Earl Drummond reached into his coat and placed 3 coins on the stump. They were followed slowly by others. Coins from coat pockets and tin cans and the hidden corners of hollow trees, laid down one by one on the flat-cut surface of the ancient chestnut until the pile amounted to $8.30. Thomas, standing at the back of the group, watched this happen. He had not spoken during any of the 3 evenings of debate. He had stood at the edges in his usual position with his usual expression, but his hand was in his coat pocket, where the recruiter's paper had lived since the afternoon at the edge of town. And when the coins were counted and found sufficient, he took his hand out of his pocket. Empty. Nobody saw it. Nobody needed to. Ruth fell ill on the 4th of November. It began as it always began with children. A slight heaviness in the morning, a reluctance to eat that Mary noticed before anyone else did. By afternoon, Ruth was running a fever that climbed steadily through the evening, and by the time the valley had gone fully dark and cold, she was burning. There was no doctor in the valley. The nearest one was in Fayetteville, a 4-hour walk away, and charged $2 for a visit. More money than the family had in their immediate possession, most of their available cash having gone toward the filing fund. Mary sat beside Ruth through the night, changing the cloth on her forehead, keeping the fire carefully banked, warm enough to fight the chill, not so hot as to worsen the fever, and doing what she had always done in crisis, which was to work steadily and methodically, and not allow the fear to occupy more space than was strictly necessary. Hattie arrived before dawn, as she had arrived on the first morning, with the same 3 unhurried knocks, the same absence of ceremony. She came in without being asked, set down a tin of rendered fat and a bundle of dried herbs that she had brought from her own stores, and moved immediately to Ruth's side with the efficiency of someone who has done this before and knows that time spent on preamble is time not spent on the patient. "How long has she been like this?" she asked. "Since yesterday afternoon," Mary said. "The fever started climbing around 3. Hattie put her hand on Ruth's forehead, then on her throat, then pressed gently on her chest. She listened to the child's breathing for a long moment. "Lung fever," she said. "Early stage. She'll be all right." Mary exhaled, a single, controlled breath that was the only outward evidence of what she had been carrying since the previous afternoon. "How do you know?" she asked. "Because I've seen it go both ways," Hattie said matter-of-factly. "This is the early stage. The breathing is clear. If we keep her warm and get the fever down by morning, she comes through it." She began preparing the herbs. A specific combination that she had learned over 6 winters in the valley produced a reliable result. Children are harder than they look. "Like their fathers," Mary said softly. Hattie glanced at her. Something passed between the two women, quick, private, the kind of communication that requires no elaboration. "Especially like their fathers," Hattie said. They worked through the night together, Mary on one side of Ruth, Hattie on the other. The fire maintained at exactly the right temperature. The cloth changed at intervals. The child's breathing monitored with the continuous, tireless attention that is the oldest form of medical care, and in the absence of everything else, still the most effective. Elijah sat against the far wall and watched, and did not sleep, and said nothing. Thomas sat in the doorway, facing out into the valley, his back to the room. This was his version of keeping vigil, present but not watching, close but not crowding, offering the only thing he currently knew how to give, which was the fact of his presence. Around 3 in the morning, Ruth's fever broke. It happened the way fevers break, gradually and then all at once, the skin shifting from dry and burning to damp and cooling, the child's breathing deepening and slowing into the different quality of sleep that is rest rather than illness. Ruth sighed once, deeply, settled, and was gone into a sleep so complete and peaceful that Mary had to check her breathing twice before she could make herself stop. Hattie washed her hands in the basin, dried them on her apron, and stood up with the deliberate care of a 60-year-old body that has been on the floor for several hours. "I'll check on her tomorrow," she said, and left. Elijah looked at his wife across the sleeping form of their daughter. Mary's face in the firelight was exhausted and relieved in something else. Something that had no clean name but that Elijah recognized because he felt it too. The specific tenderness that comes from having been afraid of losing something and then, for the moment, not losing it. He crossed the stump and sat beside her. She leaned against him briefly the way she rarely did. Not from lack of feeling, but from the habit of self-sufficiency that hard circumstances produce in people who cannot afford to put their weight on others. He put his arm around her and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the silence did not already contain. Silas rode to Morgantown on the 21st of November. He left before sunrise, alone, carrying the case documents in their oilcloth wrapping in a saddlebag borrowed from Earl Drummond's eldest son, and the $8.30 in a cloth pouch inside his coat, close against his body, the way people carry things they cannot afford to lose. He said goodbye to no one specifically. He simply saddled the horse in the gray pre-dawn dark and rode out of the valley and up the logging road and onto the main road north. And the valley watched him go in the way that small communities watch someone depart when the outcome of their errand is not yet known, with the particular, communal stillness of people who have done everything they can do and have now arrived at the part where they wait. Hattie stood outside her stump and watched the road long after the sound of hoofbeats had faded. Clara, beside her, slipped her hand into her grandmother's. Hattie did not look down, but she closed her fingers around her granddaughter's hand and held on. The valley waited. It went on doing what it had always done, the daily work of survival, which was considerable and which by the nature of its demands did not pause to accommodate fear. Water still needed to be carried. Fires still needed tending. The paths between the stumps still needed maintenance as the freeze-thaw cycle of late autumn began its slow work on the packed dirt surfaces, and the food stores needed monitoring with increasing care as December approached, and the question of what they had versus what they would need became more pressing and more precise. Thomas, during the days of waiting, worked, not in the careful, measured way he had worked since arriving, doing enough, contributing his share, maintaining the performance of someone who has not yet decided to stay. He worked the way his father worked, which was to say completely, without conserving anything for later, as though later was a concept that would have to take care of itself. He and Earl Drummond's eldest son, a 19-year-old named Jacob, broad-backed and mostly silent, who communicated primarily through the angle of his hat and the speed at which he moved, spent 3 days reinforcing the insulation of the valley's two most vulnerable stumps, packing the exterior gaps with clay and dry moss in preparation for the first serious cold. It was hard, unglamorous, freezing work, and Thomas did it without complaint, and Jacob watched him do it without comment. And by the end of the third day, they had established, through the specific language of shared physical labor, something that would eventually become a friendship. Elijah watched this from a distance and said nothing. But in the evenings, his face had a different quality. Lighter, not in the sense of happiness, but in the sense of something that had been pressing on it for months, beginning, incrementally, to ease. On the 28th day, Silas rode back into the valley. He appeared at the top of the logging road in the mid-afternoon, the horse picking its way carefully down the frost-hardened path. He was still far enough away that no one could read his expression. But his posture in the saddle, the particular set of his shoulders, the way he was sitting, told the valley what it needed to know before he was close enough to speak. He was sitting straight. Hattie, who saw him first, uncrossed her arms. Beside her, Clara made a sound that was not quite a word. Elijah came out of the stump and stood watching the road. Mary appeared in the doorway behind him. Thomas, who had been working on the path near the creek, straightened up and shielded his eyes against the thin winter light. Silas rode into the center of the valley, dismounted, and stood for a moment looking at the people gathering around him. The faces of 40-some people who had been living inside dead trees in an unnamed hollow, for reasons that ranged from the desperate to the merely unlucky, all of them watching him with the same careful, contained expression of people who have taught themselves not to expect too much. He opened his coat and removed the oilcloth package, unwrapped it, held up a single sheet of paper. "The claim is accepted," he said. "Pending review. The removal order is stayed." The valley absorbed this for a moment in silence, the specific silence that follows news that is good but not yet complete, that resolves one fear without removing the larger uncertainty that produced it. And then, slowly, it exhaled. That evening, the community gathered around a fire built in the open center of the valley, not in any individual stump, but outside, in the cold, under a sky that had cleared for the first time in 2 weeks, and was showing, for the occasion, an extravagance of stars. Someone had saved a small jug of apple brandy for a significant event, and it was passed around now without ceremony, each person taking a small measure and passing it on. Hattie sat on the flat-topped central stump and looked up at the sky and said nothing for a long time. Clara leaned against her side. Ruth, recovered and entirely herself again, sat close to the fire with Margaret Prentice's natural history book open in her lap, looking at an illustration of an American chestnut tree by firelight, the drawing showing a living specimen in full leaf, its crown spreading wide above a landscape of rolling hills. She looked at the illustration for a long time. Then she looked up at the stumps around her, dark, solid, holding the firelight on their ancient surfaces. "It was a real tree," she said, to no one in particular. Margaret, sitting beside her, looked at the illustration and then at the stumps. "One of the largest in the eastern forest," she said. "Some of them were 500 years old when they were cut." "Were they sad?" Ruth asked. "When they cut them down?" Margaret considered this seriously, the way she always considered Ruth's questions. "I think the trees didn't have feelings about it," she said, "but I think the people who cut them might have if they had allowed themselves to." Ruth looked at the stump walls around her family's dwelling, at the carved shelves visible through the doorway, at the framed window facing east, at the walls her family slept inside, that had kept the frost out and the fire in and the rain off for weeks and would do the same through the winter ahead. "They gave us something anyway," she said. "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "They did." Thomas went to bed early that night. Elijah, sitting by the fire long after most of the others had gone in, heard his son moving around inside the stump. the particular sounds of someone settling for the night, coat hung on the carved peg by the door, boots set beside the fire ring, and then the sound of paper. A long pause, and then, from inside the stump, the quiet but unmistakable sound of paper being torn. Once, twice, and then silence. Elijah stared at the fire for a long time. He did not go inside immediately. He sat with the fire and the stars in the dark valley around him and the stumps standing their patient vigil and the sound of the creek in the distance, and he let the moment be what it was. Not a conclusion, not a resolution, but a turning. The way rivers turn around bends without stopping, carrying everything forward into whatever comes next. And in the unnamed hollow in the West Virginia mountains, on a cold November night with stars overhead and fire at the center, and the walls of dead trees holding against the dark, the community that had no name and no deed and no guarantee of tomorrow went on doing the only thing it had ever known how to do, surviving, together, one day further into a future that no one had promised them but that they were building anyway, with their hands and their stubbornness and the extraordinary ordinary fact of their continued presence in the world. December came to the valley like a debt collector, quietly at first and then all at once. The temperature dropped steadily through the first week of the month, each morning colder than the one before it, the frost on the valley floor thickening from a thin, delicate silver into something dense and permanent that no longer melted by midday. The creek at the northern edge narrowed under a widening skin of gray ice. The paths between the stumps hardened into ridged, uneven surfaces that required careful footing in the dark. The sky over the ridges flattened to a uniform white that was not cloud exactly, but not clear either. The particular non-committal sky of a West Virginia winter that has not yet decided how serious it intends to be. The valley adapted as it always had, one practical adjustment at a time. Elijah had spent the final days of November completing the insulation work that he and Thomas had begun on the two most vulnerable stumps, packing the exterior gaps methodically with a mixture of clay and dried moss that Hattie had shown him, a technique she had refined over 6 winters and which she described with the impatient precision of someone who considers inefficiency a moral failing. He finished on the 29th of November and stood back to assess the work with cold hands and the satisfaction of a man who has done something correctly. Thomas had worked beside him through most of it. They had not spoken much, not from tension, but from the particular ease that sometimes settles between two people who have argued their way to a silent understanding and found, on the other side of it, that they have less need of words than they once did. The recruiter's paper was gone. Neither of them referred to it. Some things, once decided, do not require discussion. They only require the steady daily evidence of the decision, and Thomas was providing it one morning at a time, in the language of showed up and worked hard that his father understood better than any other. Mary watched this from the doorway of the stump and allowed herself carefully to feel something close to peace. The men from Meridian Land and Development arrived on the 9th of December. There were 4 of them, not surveyors this time, but men of a different professional category. A company lawyer named Aldous Vance, thin and precise in a gray overcoat carrying a leather satchel. 2 men who said nothing and whose function was apparently to occupy space and communicate, through the simple fact of their size, that the conversation was not entirely voluntary. And Gerald Holt, the same surveyor who had ridden into the valley 6 weeks earlier, who looked, in the cold December light, somewhat less comfortable than he had the first time. They rode into the valley center and stopped. The lawyer dismounted, opened his satchel, and removed a document. The valley had seen them coming. Elijah did not know exactly what early warning system the community possessed, whether it was the sound of horses on the ridge, or some network of observation that Hattie had established over 6 years without ever explaining it. But by the time the 4 men reached the central stump, almost every adult in the settlement was present. Not assembled in any formal way, not confrontational, simply there. Standing outside their stumps or on the paths between them, going about ordinary business or appearing to, occupying their valley with the quiet, unmistakable purposefulness of people who are making a point without making a scene. Hattie Boggs stood at the center stump. She had not organized this. She had simply walked out of her dwelling and stood there, and everyone else had oriented themselves accordingly, the way people orient themselves toward a fixed point in uncertain weather. Vance looked at her, then at the document in his hand, then back at her. "I'm looking for a Harriet Boggs," he said. "You found her," Hattie said. He held out the document. "I'm serving formal notice of contested title on behalf of Meridian Land and Development per the filing." "I'm aware of the filing," as Hattie said. She did not take the document. "Set it on the stump." Vance paused. It was clearly not the response he was accustomed to. He set the document on the stump. "Mrs. Boggs, I want to be direct with you. Meridian holds a valid tax deed, properly purchased and recorded. The adverse possession claim your representative filed in Morgantown is being reviewed by the court," Silas said from behind Hattie without raising his voice. He had his own document in his hand, a copy of the filing acknowledgement stamped and dated. "Which means under West Virginia law that no removal action can be enforced during the period of review. I believe you know that, Mr. Vance." Vance looked at Silas. Something shifted behind his eyes. A recalibration. "The review," he said carefully, "may not go in your favor." "It may not," Silas agreed. "We'll wait and see." A pause. The two large men said nothing. Holt looked at the stumps around him, at the framed windows and carved doorways and the evidence of continuous, careful habitation, and then looked at the ground, with the expression of someone who knows the difference between what he is being paid to do and what he believes is right, and has made his peace with the gap. "You understand," Vance said, addressing Hattie directly, "that Meridian has significant resources at its disposal, that this review process can be complicated." "I've been in this valley for 6 years," Hattie said. "I've been complicated before." Another pause. Longer this time. Then Vance picked up his satchel, snapped it closed with the crisp finality of a man who is not accustomed to leaving a conversation on someone else's terms, and walked back to his horse. "We'll be in touch," he said. "We'll be here," Hattie replied. The departure of the Meridian men left the valley in a specific kind of silence. The silence that follows a confrontation that has been resolved without resolution, that has ended for now but not finally. Elijah stood in the cold and watched the riders disappear up the logging road and felt the tension he had been holding in his chest for the past several minutes begin, slowly, to unknot itself. He turned to Silas. "That went better than I expected." "It went as I expected," Silas said. He was looking at the document Vance had left on the stump, turning the pages carefully. "They know the law. They know they can't enforce removal during review. What they were doing today was a calculation, testing how organized we are, how easily frightened, whether it's worth their time to fight this properly, or whether they should look for easier ground somewhere else." "And what did they conclude?" Silas looked up. "I think they concluded," he said, "that we are inconveniently well organized." For the first time in Elijah's memory, something approached a smile on Silas Drum's face. The weeks that followed were the hardest of the winter, and the hardest, in some ways, of the Cutter family's time in the valley, not because of any single dramatic crisis, but because of the accumulated grinding weight of the long cold, which does not arrive with the same narrative clarity as a confrontation or a fever or an eviction notice, but settles in slowly and demands something different than courage. It demands endurance. The food stores, carefully managed, proved adequate but not comfortable. There was always enough, and never more than enough. And the discipline required to maintain that line without crossing it in either direction required a constant, unglamorous attention that wore on everyone. Ruth, fully recovered from her illness, seemed largely unbothered by the cold. Children of her age possess a relationship with physical discomfort that their parents have long since lost, an ability to be miserable for a moment and then entirely fine, that adults watch with equal parts admiration and bewilderment. Thomas was the one who surprised Elijah, not with any single action, not with a dramatic gesture or a declaration, but with the steady, unremarked accumulation of daily competence that is the actual substance of character. He had become without either of them fully noticing when it happened, genuinely useful in ways that went beyond the contribution of an extra pair of hands. He understood the valley now in the specific way that comes from attention, knew which paths froze first in the morning, which stumps needed checking after a hard wind, which of the community's children were old enough to be given real responsibilities, and which ones needed watching. He had learned all of this without being taught. He had learned it the way people learn the things that matter to them, through the accumulated unremarkable dailiness of being present and paying attention. Jacob Drummond, in the way of someone who communicates primarily through the angle of his hat, adjusted the angle of his hat in Thomas's direction one morning in a way that Elijah, watching from a distance, interpreted correctly as respect. The letter arrived in February. It was brought up from town by a neighbor's boy, a letter addressed to the settlement in a formal hand, bearing the seal of the Circuit Court of Monongalia County, West Virginia. Silas received it, opened it, read it standing at the edge of the valley in the winter light, and then walked to where Hattie was working outside her stump. He held out the letter without speaking. She took it, read it again. The court had scheduled a hearing date for March the 14th. Both parties were required to present evidence. The outcome of the hearing would determine whether the adverse possession claim was sustained or dismissed. March, Hattie said. 5 weeks, Silas said. We have 5 weeks to prepare. She looked at the letter for a long moment. Then she looked at the valley around her, at the stumps in the winter light, at the smoke from the morning fires, at the frozen creek glinting at the northern edge, at the ridge above where the bare-branched chestnut stood against a pale sky. Then we'd better get to work, she said. The preparation consumed the 5 weeks between the letter and the hearing date with a thoroughness that transformed the valley's daily rhythms entirely. Silas worked every available hour, organizing the years of documentation he had accumulated into a coherent legal argument. Residency records, boundary surveys, detailed logs of continuous habitation and improvement, witness statements from every adult in the valley, affidavits drafted with Margaret Prentice's assistance and signed by hands that were better accustomed to axes and plows than to legal documents. Margaret herself produced from somewhere in the depths of her 200 books a volume on West Virginia property law that she had apparently been keeping specifically for this purpose, a fact that struck Elijah when he learned of it as the single most premeditated act of optimism he had ever witnessed. "You brought a law book," he said. "I brought 200 books," she said, without looking up from her writing. I didn't know which ones I was going to need. Elijah, who had not smiled significantly in some time, found his face doing something that required adjustment. The community contributed in the ways it knew. Earl Drummond and his sons reinforced every path and structure in the valley that might be inspected, not from vanity, but from the understanding that a judge sent to assess the quality and permanence of habitation would draw conclusions from what he saw, and what he saw should make the strongest possible case. Mary organized the women of the settlement in producing a written account of the valley's community life, its informal governance, its shared resources, its collective practices, that would serve as evidence of the kind of sustained, organized habitation that the law required. Thomas helped Earl's sons with the physical work, and helped Margaret with the writing, and helped Silas carry documents to the road when the weather permitted, and in the evenings sat by the fire with his father, and did not talk about Pittsburgh and did not talk about leaving, and did not, as far as Elijah could tell, think about either one. On the morning of March the 14th, Silas and Hattie rode to Morgantown together. They left before dawn. The valley was very still in the cold dark, the stumps dark against a sky not yet light, the frost on the paths unmarked by footprints, the creek silent under its thinning March ice. One by one, as the sound of the horses reached them, the adults of the settlement came to their doorways and watched the two figures ride up the logging road and disappear over the ridge. No one spoke. There was nothing to say that the silence didn't already carry. Elijah stood outside until the sound of hoofbeats had entirely faded. Then he went inside, where Mary was heating water for the morning, and Ruth was sitting up in her blankets with the natural history book open in her lap, examining, in the early light from the east-facing window, the illustration of the American chestnut. "Will they come back with good news?" Ruth asked. "I don't know," Elijah said. "Do you think they will?" He sat down beside her and looked at the illustration over her shoulder, the living tree, spreading its crown above the rolling hills, enormous and unhurried and entirely unaware of what was coming for it. "I think," he said carefully, "that Hattie Boggs has been waiting for this day for 6 years, and I think that Silas Drum has been building this case for 2. And I think that when 2 people that stubborn walk into a courtroom together, the courtroom has a harder day than they do." Ruth considered this. "That's not the same as yes," she said. "No," Elijah agreed. "It's not." She leaned against his arm. He put his hand on top of her head, briefly, and looked out the east-facing window at the morning coming over the ridge. And the valley waited, as it had always waited, as the Stumps had waited for decades before any of them arrived, with the patient, enduring steadiness of things that have already survived more than most people thought they could, and have learned from that survival not certainty, but the particular, hard-won capacity to go on not knowing and keep working anyway. They came back in the late afternoon. The valley heard the horses before it saw them, the sound carrying down from the ridge in the way sound carries across, still cold air, clear and precise, reaching the settlement a full minute before Hattie and Silas appeared at the top of the logging road. In that minute, the valley assembled itself with the same quiet, unhurried instinct as before, people appearing in doorways, emerging from paths, stopping whatever they were doing and orienting toward the ridge, toward the sound, toward the 2 figures that eventually became visible against the pale March sky. They were riding at an easy pace. That was the first thing Elijah noticed. Not hurried, not slumped. An easy pace. The pace of people who are not carrying bad news and are not in a particular rush, because the thing that was going to happen has happened, and it is done. Silas was sitting straight in the saddle. The valley exhaled. Collectively, simultaneously, without any single person deciding to. It simply exhaled, the way a held breath releases when the thing that was feared has passed. Hattie rode into the center of the settlement and dismounted. She handed her reins to Jacob Drummond's younger brother without being asked, and stood for a moment, not speaking, looking at the faces of the people gathered around her. She had the expression of someone who has been holding something important for a long time and is now, carefully, setting it down. "The claim is sustained," she said. 3 words. Quiet even, without drama. The valley received them in silence for a moment, not from lack of feeling, but from the nature of the feeling itself, which was too large and too complex and too deeply mixed with everything that had preceded it to resolve into simple noise. And then, slowly, unevenly, in the way that real responses come rather than performed ones, it began to sound. Voices, movement, the particular quality of release that is not exactly joy but contains it, along with exhaustion and relief and grief and gratitude and the specific, complicated emotion of people who have been told that the ground beneath their feet belongs to them. Hattie stood in the middle of it and did not smile. She looked at Clara, who was standing close and watching her grandmother with the focused, serious attention of a child who understands that this is a moment worth remembering. She put one hand on Clara's shoulder, briefly. That was all. Silas told them the details that evening, by the fire. Judge Harlan Poole of the Circuit Court of Monongalia County had heard both sides over the course of 4 hours. Aldous Vance had presented Meridian Land's case competently and with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. He had argued that the tax deed purchase was valid, that the community's presence on the land was unauthorized, that the adverse possession doctrine required a stricter interpretation than the petitioners were claiming. Silas had presented the documentation he had spent 2 years preparing. Residency records going back to 1881, boundary surveys, evidence of continuous, open, and productive use of every acre of the valley floor, the structures, the paths, the water systems, the food cultivation, the community organization. Margaret Prentice's written account of the valley's governance and shared resources, witness statements from every adult in the settlement, including the newest arrivals. And then Hattie had taken the stand. She had spoken for 22 minutes, Silas said. Without notes, without preparation that he had witnessed, though he suspected she had been preparing for 6 years. She had described in plain and specific language every winter she had spent in the valley, every family that had arrived, every structure that had been built and improved, every difficulty that had been faced and managed. She had described her husband cutting the first stump while she held the lantern in a winter so cold, the axe rang like a bell against the frozen wood. The judge, Silas said, asked her one question after she finished. "What was it?" Mary asked. He asked her whether she had ever, at any point during her 6 years in the valley, attempted to conceal her presence or her use of the land. A pause. "What did she say?" Elijah asked. She said, "I cut windows facing the road, Judge. You can see my smoke from the ridge. Anybody who wanted to know I was here could have asked." A silence. And then, from somewhere in the gathered community, a sound that was partway between a laugh and something else. The sound of people recognizing a truth stated so plainly that it needed no elaboration. Vance, Silas continued, objected on the grounds that this was non-responsive to the question of concealment. "What did the judge say?" Margaret asked. Silas looked at her. He said, "The witness answered the question. Move on, Mr. Vance." The legal victory was real, but Silas was careful in the days that followed to ensure that everyone in the valley understood precisely what it was and what it was not. It was a sustained adverse possession claim, filed under Hattie Boggs's name, covering the valley land that the community occupied. It was a court finding that their continuous, open, and productive habitation of the land for over 5 years constituted a legally recognizable claim superior to Meridian's tax deed. It was not a title. Not yet. Title would require additional proceedings, a process that Silas estimated would take another year at minimum, and that would require the continued demonstration of the same qualities that had won the initial ruling: organized presence, maintained structures, documented community life. Which means, Silas said, at the community meeting where he explained all of this, that we have won the right to keep building what we've been building, nothing more and nothing less. "That's enough," Hattie said from her place at the back of the gathering. It was what it always was with her, not a comfort, not an encouragement, but a plain statement of fact. It was enough. It was, in the specific context of what they had faced, and what they had done together, entirely and sufficiently enough. Spring came to the valley the way it always came to the Appalachian hollows, reluctantly in stages with several setbacks before it committed. The ice on the creek broke in the second week of March. By the end of the month, the first green was appearing on the valley floor, tentative, pale, easily mistaken for wishful thinking until it wasn't. In April, the chestnuts still living on the upper slopes put out their first leaves, and the ridge above the valley went from the bare gray of winter to a green so new and so intense that it seemed almost aggressive, almost impolite in its insistence on existing. Ruth, who had spent the winter studying the natural history primer with a dedication that Margaret Prentice said was the most encouraging thing she had seen in a decade of teaching, began identifying plants along the creek bank with the focused solemnity of a small scientist, crouching over specimens and consulting the book and announcing her conclusions to whoever happened to be nearby, whether they had asked or not. She identified 7 species of wildflower, 3 types of fern, and what she believed, with some support from Margaret and considerable skepticism from Hattie, who had 6 years of practical botanical knowledge and a limited tolerance for book-derived confidence, was a medicinal herb used by the Cherokee people of the eastern mountains. Hattie examined the plant for a long moment. "You're not wrong," she said finally. Ruth did not say anything, but the expression that crossed her face was one that her father, watching from a distance, recognized immediately. It was the expression of someone who has just discovered that knowing something and being right about it are experiences that, when they coincide, feel like nothing else. Thomas left for Pittsburgh in May, not with the recruiter's paper. That was long gone, torn and forgotten. He left with a different kind of preparation, a letter of introduction written by Margaret Prentice, who knew a woman in Pittsburgh whose husband managed a small printing operation, and who had been, Margaret said, generally decent to his employees in her admittedly limited observation. He left with $20 saved from 6 months of odd jobs in the valley and in the nearest towns, the product of the same steady, unhurried accumulation with which he had done everything since November. He left with Jacob Drummond's handshake, and Hattie's unsmiling nod, and Clara's frank announcement that she expected letters, and he left with Ruth hanging onto his arm at the edge of the valley and asking, with the specific emotional intelligence of an 8-year-old who understands more than adults give her credit for, whether he was going to come back. "To visit," he said. "How often?" "Often enough." She studied him with the evaluating seriousness she applied to botanical specimens and legal questions and everything else she considered worth examining carefully. Then she released his arm. "All right," she said, in a tone and cadence so precisely like her mother's that Thomas laughed, the first time, in Elijah's memory, that he had laughed without reservation in a very long time. At the edge of the valley, before the logging road began to climb, Thomas stopped and turned back. He looked at the stumps in the May morning light, at the carved windows and the framed doors, at the smoke from the morning fires, at his family standing together at the valley's edge. He looked at all of it for a long moment, with the expression of someone making a deliberate, conscious effort to remember. Then he turned and walked up the road and did not turn back again. Not because he was not feeling it. Elijah could see from the set of his son's shoulders that he was feeling all of it. But because Thomas Cutter was 16 going on 17 and had decided, somewhere over the course of a winter in a hollow tree, that the difference between a person who leaves and a person who abandons is whether they carry the place they came from with them, or whether they set it down. He was carrying it. Elijah watched until his son disappeared over the ridge. Mary stood beside him, her arm through his, and did not say anything for a long time. Then, "He'll be fine. I know," Elijah said. "You're sure?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sure he'll figure out how to be fine," which is the same thing. The first letter arrived 11 weeks later. It came on a Tuesday, carried up from town by the neighbor's boy who had brought the court letter in February, and it was addressed in Thomas's handwriting. Careful, slightly cramped, the handwriting of someone who did not write often but was trying to do it well. Mary read it aloud by the evening fire, her voice steady and even, pausing only at the places where the words required it. Thomas had the job at the printing operation. He had a room in a boarding house 3 blocks from the river. He described Pittsburgh with the slightly dazed specificity of someone encountering a large city for the first time. The noise of it, the scale of it, the quality of the light off the river in the early morning that was different from any light he had seen before. He said the work was real and the hours were what had been agreed, and the foreman was not a generous man but a fair one, which was, he wrote, probably the best you could reasonably ask for. He said he was not happy yet. He wrote it plainly, without self-pity, in the way he had learned, in a valley, in a winter, in the company of people who had no use for evasion, to say true things. He said he thought he might be eventually. He said the city was full of people who had come from somewhere else and were in the process of figuring out what that meant, and he found that he had more in common with them than he had expected. "He sounds like himself," Ruth observed when Mary finished reading. "Yes," Mary said. "He does." Elijah looked at the fire. "That's enough," he said, and meant it completely. Summer moved through the valley with a generosity that the winter had not suggested it was capable of. The community grew. 2 new families arrived in June, following the same informal network of information that had brought the others, and were received by Hattie Boggs with the same unsentimental practicality she had applied to the Cutters on their first morning. Assessment of tools, identification of the most urgent structural needs, delivery of food without ceremony, and the clear, unspoken communication that they were welcome here, and that welcome in this valley meant work. The legal process moved at the pace of legal processes, slowly, with intervals of waiting that required management and intervals of activity that required preparation. Silas continued his documentation work with undiminished intensity. Margaret continued translating the legal proceedings into language that the community could act on. The structures in the valley continued to be improved, maintained, and, in 2 cases, significantly expanded, as the families who had been here longest began, for the first time, to plan not just for survival but for something longer. Earl Drummond, who had never in anyone's memory spoken more than was strictly necessary, spent 3 weeks that summer building a proper door for his family's stump. A door with real hinges, salvaged from a derelict barn, and a latch that caught cleanly and held. He finished it on a Thursday afternoon and stood back and looked at it for a long time with his hands at his sides. His wife came out and stood beside him. "It's a good door," she said. "Yes," he said. They went back inside. In September, the valley got its name. Not officially, not on any map or county record or legal document, but the families that lived there began, in the natural, unconscious way that communities name the places that matter to them, calling it Chestnut Hollow. It was Ruth who said it first, or so the general memory of the community held. She had been describing the valley to Margaret during one of their afternoon sessions, explaining the location of a fern stand she had found near the creek, and she had said, "It's in the north corner of Chestnut Hollow, near the second bend," as though the name had always existed and she was simply using it. Margaret had looked at her. "Chestnut Hollow," she said. "Yes," Ruth said, with the confidence of someone stating a fact rather than proposing one. By the following week, everyone in the settlement was using it. By the week after that, it was the only name anyone had for the place, and the absence of a name that had persisted for 6 years was simply gone, replaced as naturally and completely as a gap in a row of teeth. Hattie, when she heard it, said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "That's right. The full title to the land, the formal, legal, recorded title, bearing the name of Harriet Boggs and acknowledging the community's claim in the language of property law, arrived in the spring of 1890. Silas brought it from Morgantown on a Tuesday morning, riding into the valley with the paper in his oilcloth wrapping and the straight-shouldered posture of a man who has spent years working toward a specific moment and is now, finally, inside it. He gave the document to Hattie without ceremony. She took it and read it carefully, standing at the central stump in the spring morning, the valley around her green and active with the sounds of a community going about its daily work. She read every word of it, the legal language, the court seal, the recorded date, the precise description of the land boundaries that matched she knew, the surveys in Silas's notebooks almost exactly. When she finished, she set it down on the